Hello, everyone. Good evening and warm welcome to the LTS webinars. My name is Cosmin Patlagianu, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the 35th edition of the Lux of Technology series. So now, before we start, I'd like to share with you a few words about the session today, about the agenda. So in just a few minutes, Marcin will start his presentation on how to manage, or even better, how he put it, how not to manage vulnerabilities. His speech will last for approximately 1 hour, and it will be followed by a questions and answers session. You have the possibility to interact with our guest, and definitely encourage you to do so through the Q&A chat functionality. So as you now see on the panel on your screen, you can just pick the Q&A box and send a question to our speaker. Marcin will comment and answer after his presentation, but anyways, you can send your questions at any given point in time. In that particular case, if we get so many questions that Marcin won't have the time to answer them all, then definitely you can contact him via LinkedIn or via one of the communication means that he'll be sharing with you. Also, if you would like to be up to date with all the stuff that we're doing, with all the latest news and events, please follow the Luxoft pages on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. And now I'll pass the floor to Marcin. Once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you get a lot of valuable information and enjoy the session. And now the word goes to Marcin.
Hello and welcome to Luxoft Technology Series webinar. Thanks for Cosmin for having that nice introduction and going through the agenda of today's webinar. So I'm really pleased to meet with you and talk about information security topic that is around managing vulnerabilities. Today's topic I specifically chosen to spin around in that way to outline that I will be talking about common mistakes and problems that you can actually see in number of vulnerability process management tools and vulnerability management processes inside organization or software development life cycles, or many other actually environments. So the reason for me to go over that way is that most commonly you should learn from mistakes, and it's better to learn from not yours mistake but someone else, and accumulating that kind of a knowledge, that kind of advices on how not to do this is kind of I think beneficial for project managers, solution architects, and many other software and infrastructure engineers. So before I go deeply into the topic, let me introduce myself. My name is Marcin Swiety. I am leading information security practice here at Luxoft, and I am based out of Krakow, Poland. My background is purely technical. I started as an IT security engineer, where I've been tasked with developing software, especially software for security purposes, a lot of testing and a lot of security integration work has been done there. And then I moved to information system auditing and penetration testing. This is the area that mostly contributed to today's webinar, because actually I've seen a number of situations when either development or management failed to properly address some vulnerabilities or improperly handled security requirements, and the product ended up with bad security posture. After that, I moved to information security management, which was around maintaining security for large environments, global data centers, and then I was tasked not only for finding the vulnerabilities, but actually being accountable for fixing them and getting them out of the environment, which is of course challenging at times. As Cosmin already said, you can always connect with me through LinkedIn or Skype, or you can use global luxoft.com page. There is a contact form on that web page, and you can always contact us in that manner. As I've already mentioned, I'm leading information security practice here at Blacksoft. And to explain a little bit more what we are doing here, we are a department that is covering a number of industries at the same time. So we are more of a horizontal practice in that sense. Our work is dedicated to finding and accumulating knowledge from all the industries and making the challenge for our customers easily overcome. You can imagine, for instance, finance industry or banking industry being able to actually deal with risk and vulnerabilities pretty nicely. But how can you take the same principles and the same processes and make them applicable in embedded design or in vehicle development? So we are the department that actually works on that cases and helps our customer to build better products with security built in right from the start. And today's topic that I selected is kind of motivated on the recent report and research that our Excellion brand, the Blacksoft Financial Services brand, shown to the public, whereas it actually shown that nearly half of the IT decision makers say that cybersecurity is keeping them awake at night. And this is, I would say, devastating statistic, but I kind of want to say that it might be even better than it was before. And to prove that, I selected a couple of three points to bump this up. First is there are two breaches, I would say, recently in recent months that confirmed that cybersecurity is becoming a pretty big deal, and especially the security of managing vulnerabilities and timely patching them. So first off, there was a WannaCry campaign. This was a global widespread of malware in form of ransomware. It used Microsoft SMB protocol implementation vulnerability. And what is important, this vulnerability was already fixed at the time when the infection began. So it was already announced to be fixed by 2 months, and the software update was already communicated, and it still affected an extremely big number of hosts in an extremely big amount of countries. And when we see and we look at the affected parties, the UK's National Health Service or FedEx, we can actually definitely say that these are the big players. They definitely know their way around cybersecurity, and they definitely know why getting vulnerability patched is so important, but they still fail to do so. And the other example of how vulnerability management can be devastating to the business is the Equifax case. Equifax is a company that scores credit in the US, and it was subject to hacking exploitation of, again, 2 months old vulnerability in Apache Struts. And by 2 months old vulnerability, I mean that it was already fixed by Apache Foundation 2 months before the hack actually happened. In the effect of that activity, more than 100 millions of US citizens have been affected. Attackers access social security numbers, which is a pretty big deal for US citizens because it usually leads to identity theft. And in this particular case, failure to patch was not only the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that they also failed to notify the individuals in the process. So we can see that the effects of that are not only devastating to the companies, to the organization that are being affected, but also to the individuals that are using services of that organizations. And there is one nice report that I recall from 2015 from NOPSEC. The researchers from that report verified how much it takes on average to remediate security vulnerability in different industries. And one of the numbers there catches interest pretty quickly, because it says that on average it took 176 days to remediate security vulnerability in financial industry. And this is a big number when compared to those 2 months in the problems of WannaCry or Equifax. This is like too much. Probably it's better by now because this report is 2 years old, but I wouldn't say that that the problem actually disappeared. And the WannaCry and Equifax case actually proves that to be true. So before we jump directly into those advices that I have for you, I want to sync up on what I actually understand as vulnerability management. For me, vulnerability management is a process that is focused on improving security of the product, process, or environment by mitigating the risk that is associated with this vulnerability. There are two objectives that actually are important to get it done. First one is that you have to find and identify vulnerabilities. And I would want to say you need to find and identify all vulnerabilities, but usually that's not possible. You are limited in budget and time constraints. You obviously cannot spend half of the budget on finding the vulnerability of the product or environment that you are running, and you still need to deliver the product in the end run. So you will not be able to find all vulnerabilities, but you need to do as many as possible. On the other hand, you have another objective that says that you have to effectively fix the vulnerabilities. And by effectively, I mean timely, so as soon as possible, and fully, so to the extent that is acceptable for a company a risk profile. So additional to that, it's quite important also to understand what I understand as sources of information for vulnerability management. For me, vulnerability management is not only about getting an automated vulnerability scan. So this is I would say, one of the sources of information that you can get information from, but there are a lot of stuff that you can do around vulnerability management. There's definitely a phase where you can implement security review and security testing that will verify whether you have problems on your design or your architecture, even before you have actually started something, even if you have only the sole idea and some design sketch. There's also a lot of things that you can get from those automated processes like vulnerability scanning, source code analysis, or security testing. These ones are definitely the ones that you need to cover deeply in your processes, because this is the same stuff that your attackers will do. So if you don't do that, the attackers will do that for you, but they will definitely use the information from that to bring harm to your product and business. Another set of sources of information that are very valuable are penetration testing and bug bounty program. They are kind of similar because they are tasked to find more complex, more advanced, and more sophisticated attack vectors and vulnerabilities, but they differ a little bit in the way of doing that. So penetration test is usually something that you order. So you have to assign some budget to that, and you have to think on how much time it will take to actually perform that penetration test. So you are putting both the limitation on the scope and both limitation on the time constraint. Whereas the bug bounty program is usually not that, I would say, limited. So the bug bounty program participants usually wants to spend just enough time for them to get the reward. So it means sometimes that you can get a nice research and nice expertise doing that penetration test for you without actually talking about time limitations or limitation in the scope. So this is a good thing to consider when you are running extremely crucial product or service. But there is another group of sources of information that is usually omitted by project managers or product managers. There are places that you can look for vulnerability information even before the vulnerability is being implemented as part of the vulnerability scanning tool or source code analysis tool or some kind of automated penetration testing tool. When you look at the vendor sites or security bulletins, discussion lists, or security research forums, you can find that some of the vulnerabilities, when they are discovered, they will be communicated there. So you can be ahead of the whole incident, and you can act on this information even before there is a patch, or even before you have that information from other sources like vulnerability scan or a penetration test. And The last part that I want to also cover here is something that is very uncommon to be shown here is security information and event management system. This one is usually used to detect and respond to incidents that are happening in your environment, in your application or project. But actually, you can leverage that information that is being stored there to actively look for the incidents, but going back from the incident to look for the vulnerability. I know it's too late by then, probably because the attack is being already carried out, but it might help to be much more, let's say, to allow you to facilitate you a way to investigate very complex and very problematic to analyze cases of, for instance, misusing business logic in your application. That is definitely something that will not be able to detect in doing a vulnerability scan or source code analysis. This is something that sometimes happens to be just omitted in the process. So you can leverage that information as well. Okay, so let's start with the first anti-advice that I have for you. So if you really want to ruin the project by lowering the security of it, then you should think about moving the security activities near the end of the production. This is, I think, very, very obvious one. So the most common mistakes here are that usually when you run the software product or implementation product, even on the infrastructure level, you think that just ordering to do a penetration test at the end, like before it's put on the production, will be just enough. This is a major mistake. But sometimes it comes in some other way. So sometimes I saw that some companies wants to hire a security consultant at the beginning of the project just to add some security requirements and then leave it as it is. So it's another way of actually misusing the approach of adding security requirements, because requirements over time tend to change. The project will as well have some additional stuff to be checked from a security standpoint. And there is also another set of stuff that you need to have to adhere to when you have already this software in the production. And another mistake is that you can test this security sometimes with limited scope. So if you move this security near the end, you will probably have not enough time to do that thoroughly. So you will concentrate on these parts that probably are facing internet or some external networks. And this is something that you definitely need to do, but it's something that shouldn't be the sole security part of your project. If you would rather go around and look for the problem in your environment, and rather want to avoid that, there are a number of symptoms that you can actually leverage and look for to identify whether you are burdened with this problem. And just by looking at the report that you got from a vulnerability scan or penetration test, you can a little bit get the hint whether you implemented security too late in the process. So if you see that the vulnerabilities that are being reported are lying deeply in the design and they have enormous efforts required to be fixed, that means that probably the problem was that the security was not done on the design phase or architectural phase. Also, if you see that the vulnerabilities are related to only one small part of the environment that you're running, probably that is also an indicator for you that there was not enough time to cover the full scope of the environment. And also looking at the experience and what the project that I've run or a consultant on, having a number of vulnerabilities, overwhelming number of vulnerabilities close to the go live stage is something that is also showing that the security hasn't been either properly estimated at the beginning or hasn't been actually addressed at the beginning. So this is something that you should definitely look for if you would want to identify this as a problem. As a proper approach and the proper advice that I have for you is that you should think about security as something that you have to implement everywhere and right from the start. That means that you have to involve security expertise at the beginning. So that means that at the feasibility analysis stage, and you have to maintain that expertise over the project execution. And also you have to really understand that vulnerabilities are not they're not of the same type. You can find different vulnerabilities on different stages of the project execution. There are, of course, vulnerabilities and weaknesses on the design phase. There are those that were technical on the backend, database infrastructure, interface, and all that. But there are also vulnerabilities that are related to effectiveness of your security controls. So whether your intrusion detection and prevention system is operating in a normal way and catching actually those intrusions and attacks that it should have. Another way of changing how your security posture of your product will look like is approaching management over the results. So I have 3 advices here to actually adhere to that and then connect to that. And the first one is a pretty, I would say, obvious, but I've seen too much of getting it improperly handled in the past, so I decided to get it again here. So if you have a product that is consists of number of moving parts, and you get the vulnerability report or penetration testing report or any other source of information that actually gives you some coverage of vulnerabilities, and you get that report and tag it as a final report, you will definitely put yourself in a very, very bad and ineffective position. Reports that are generated from vulnerability scanners or even from penetration testers sometimes tend to have some problems with false positives. And there's some problem by that. I mean that sometimes the relevance of the results is not totally aligned with the real state of the environment. So what do you need to look for if you would rather avoid that? You need to look at whether the report doesn't consist of many vulnerabilities that actually cannot be exploited, or many of the vulnerabilities are actually not true. An example for that is looking at some table of vulnerabilities that are saying about vulnerable Linux operating system, whereas it actually is affected. The host that is affected is running Windows. So this is a common situation that it happens on using very, I would say, roughly and standardly generated reports from tools, because sometimes those professional tools tend to make mistakes, and the fingerprinting is pretty good, but sometimes it makes those mistakes. So you have to go over that very carefully. And also, a very important thing to note is if you have a report that says that you have a very small amount of critical and high vulnerabilities, but most of them are in the low and trivial area, that probably will mislead your work, because most of that vulnerabilities will actually not be applicable to your environment. So what you're looking at, you're looking at transforming that report into something that is more usable, something that you can actually act on. So getting rid of all the false positives, checking whether your data is actually valid, and whether you don't have too much of the vulnerabilities that you will not go into fixing because you can live with them. So when we are around this topic of handling results, there is also a problem and mistake that you can do with that is don't group and don't categorize the results. And what I'm meaning by that is if you cannot count how many vulnerabilities are affecting one specific host, or you cannot do this around, so you are not able to enlist how many hosts are being affected by one specific vulnerability, then you will have hard problem with actually dealing with that vulnerability. In the end, we will get a very, very pragmatic approach also with discussing the fixing actions with the development department or sysadmin department, because you will have only a very unstructured report that will contain all of that information that is not totally applicable and interesting for the department that you are talking with. So the proper approach that you should employ is you should be able to categorize and group the vulnerabilities per organizational unit that you have in your environment. So let's say you have your environment running software that is affecting network, operating system. Some of that is affecting also some other third parties. So what you ideally need to do is to have ability to split that report into those areas of responsibility that are reflected in your organizational structure. So when you already have that categorization and grouping enabled in your methodology, another way of doing problems and implementing problems in your process is improper categorization on the severity rating, on the risk rating of the vulnerabilities. So what I've seen very commonly is that the reports have been provided with standard tool supplied severity rating, and that severity rating propagated to the final report. This is, I would say, not so bad approach, because the tool provided severity rating is at least something, but definitely it's not something that is aligned with your in your environment and with your business. So this is something that you should consider very, very thoroughly when you are doing this, because the severity rating that you have on the report might be totally misleading for your mitigation actions. So for instance, you might have a vulnerability, a critical vulnerability on your testing environment, whereas some moderate vulnerability will be waiting for resolution on your mission critical production environment. So this is something that you need to leverage and balance out in your in planning the mitigation of your vulnerabilities. Another topic that is touching the mitigation actions is actually how to approach it. Common mistakes that are clearly visible here is that this report, after you get that report to people that are interested in fixing them, sometimes that the following phase of fixing them and mitigating them is based on the complexity rather than the risk. And this is totally not applicable for maintaining a proper security posture. So the most common mistakes is letting the development teams or sysadmin teams to solely decide what to fix first and what to fix in the later stage. And also, treating the vulnerability as a bug is another way of having new problems being introduced to your vulnerability management program, because you will simply get rid of the security factor with the vulnerability. And for development, it's usually a case for bugs. So if the bug is fixed, then the case is closed. But you have to reassess the residual risk at the end. So the usual symptoms that you can look for to see is that some of the easy fixes are being implemented at the beginning, and sometimes these easy fixes are not the most important one from risk perspective. So if you see that after you deliver the report, then the first one to serve are the ones that are totally not important from security standpoint to be fixed in the first place, then probably you don't have a proper prioritization of the planned mitigation actions. Of course, also, if you don't have capability to measure what is the residual risk after the vulnerability has been fixed, then you will have a hard time justifying whether this vulnerability really was mitigated or not, or just simply it was closed. Proper approach here is that you should employ risk methodology and risk management methodology here that takes into account both impact and likelihood. In some methodology, it's called exploitability. So this way, you can actually assign proper risk rating and drive your mitigation actions according to this risk profile. And this is quite effective on getting the risk rating and the exposure minimized in most efficient way. Also, a huge driver for your action should be also connected to cost-benefit analysis. This is something that you have to leverage when you decide whether to fix the vulnerability or not, or how to fix it, actually, what to do with that vulnerability. And by cost-effective analysis, cost-benefit analysis, I mean that you have to think whether the actions that you are planning to implement, whether they will be less costly than actually what you are trying to protect. So you can imagine having some internal system for some kind of a ticketing or reporting, internal reporting functionality, being vulnerable to some kind of a denial of service attack. So implementing a full anti-DDoS solution there might be totally not logical due to the cost and the value that the system brings to you. So sometimes it might be just easier to accept the risk or to implement proper monitoring and compensating measures. And as we are at the topic of treating the risk in some other ways, there's also advice that that goes directly from a couple of reports that I saw that insisted on fixing all the vulnerabilities. And by fixing, they mean to get the patch or update implemented. This is actually a very, very problematic approach, because if you solely think about fixing and installing patches, you might end up in a situation when the fix is not possible. So for instance, imagine you are running a legacy application somewhere in your network, and this legacy application is no longer maintained, vendor support ended, so you actually cannot get vendor updates for that. And if you don't care about the budget, you can obviously spend half year building a security update on your own and fixing that on your own, or you can just simply move that software to a new platform and then replace it with a new version, which will of course also cost a lot of money. But sometimes it might be just easier to get rid of the vulnerability in some other way. And as an example, I have once in one of our projects, we had a network device that was shipped with a web interface that allowed you to download the client for the PC for the administrator to use. And that web server was really like configured very like back 2 years back. So it was full of vulnerabilities, not only from the configuration point, but also from the version of the web server. So getting the proper fix from the vendor side, that might be totally not cost effective and so simply not logical. It was just easier to download the binary, put it on the repository, save repository, and just disable this web interface. So you have to think actively on other ways of mitigating the risk, because there might be easier and less costly approach that you can leverage to get rid of the risk that is associated with that vulnerability. So when we already have that vulnerability fixed, or we think that the vulnerability is fixed, we usually stumble upon, I would say, a problem of aligning what we think is right and what really has happened. So the most common mistakes that I can point here is that the development team or sysadmin team sometimes provide a feedback that is not totally accurate. So if you take that feedback for granted, or you assume that since the new version has been shipped or released, then all of the vulnerabilities that you reported probably has been fixed, yeah, that is a wrong way to approach this topic. If you don't work with development team, or if you don't work with sysadmins actively on actually how to fix the vulnerability, then you probably will end up in one of those situations when the vulnerability is either partially fixed or only looking as fixed, or sometimes the development department or sysadmin department will not understand even what is the real attack vector, so they will not be able to fix it in normal way. So this is a huge problem if you just ship the report and expect the development and sysadmin teams to fix it on their own, because this will actually open you to a new number of problems. proper approach that you should employ is you have to actively work with the development. You have to check if the vulnerability is really fixed by doing that rescanning or manually. This is ideally, and checking on your own whether this particular vulnerability has been already fixed. If you don't have the capability to run another penetration test or rescan after you get that confirmation that this vulnerability is fixed, then you should at least look for logs and change requests or some comments in source code repository, because this is another way of looking if actually something happened in that environment. And I've seen a number of cases where vulnerability has reappeared on the production environment, even though that was already tested and then it actually got rid of the vulnerability in the first place, but it was rolled back because it introduced another set of problems somewhere else. So you have to consider that the vulnerability is resolved only when you see that in the production environment, in the final product, because other than that, you might just lose one vulnerability and consider it as a closed, whereas it's reappeared in the production environment. And this is connected to the advice that I have about rescanning. So if you assume that the patch to one vulnerability has fixed the vulnerability and that's all, then probably you are missing some other parts of the problem, because our software that we are running right now, or network that we are maintaining, is a set of interdependent modules. And fixing vulnerabilities is not always as easy as installing the patch. Sometimes it affects some other areas as well. If you don't clean up the code, or if you don't look for things that might have changed during that fixing, you might end up in trading one vulnerability for another, or a set of another. Usual symptoms that you can spot in that situation is that after you got your fix implemented in the network, and you do another penetration test after some time, you see that the number of vulnerabilities increase like crazy, but yeah, nothing really changed in the network. So this is a cruel case of not testing or not rescanning after the fix, and to confirm whether this particular case resolved the vulnerability but didn't introduce new ones. And to bring an example here, not so long time ago, Windows has been shipped with an update that caused the computer, the PC, to be stuck in a restart loop. And then after that, there was a notification not to install the patch, or another notification that rolled back the previous update, and another update that will install and resolve the vulnerability in the first place. So those are like cascading effects of patching, and you don't want to get into that position. You need to thoroughly ship and test your patches and your updates. So the proper approach after you get your fix into the environment is to do the rescanning of the full environment. I know it's totally not always applicable, but you should do that and consider that as a valid point for maintaining security in a proper way. You also need to clean up the code and clean up the environment after every time you have done something for the debugging or some temporary changes. And when I say debugging and temporary changes, I'm not only referring to software, but also to the infrastructure. Leaving a temporary rule on the firewall that opens some direct access or debug traffic might be just as dangerous for you and for your business as inviting attackers simply to steal your data, because sometimes it's just the same as leaving the debug interface open. So you have to thoroughly consider that fixes do not come with the price. You have to think whether they have whether they are not burdened with some additional vulnerabilities as well. And the last two advices that I have are more about the whole process of managing. So most commonly when you think about managing vulnerabilities is going from report to report. And this is the most common approach because that's how we deal with the budgeting for penetration testing. That's how we usually perceive this approach to fix the vulnerabilities, because the new penetration test will have new vulnerabilities, so we will probably focus on the new one as well. But the problem with that approach is that you lose the visibility to what actually has been already fixed and what is still need to be fixed. And you have that proper measure and proper security posture check at the point of when you receive the report. So in between the reports, you have no idea how your risk rating of your environment, of your product looks like. And also, if you run the vulnerability management from report to report, the mitigation efforts will be justified by the report itself and what is said in the report, instead of the proper risk and risk that it puts on your business. So this is something that might be also a problem for finding additional budget to get those risks remediated. And another symptom is, if you run your vulnerability scan or vulnerability management from time to time, so called like every quarter, you might find yourself in a position when your vulnerabilities that are already overdue are waiting till the next scan or next penetration test until they are confirmed to be overdue. So only then you escalate. And sometimes to wait for 3 months to get that confirmation that some vulnerability is still there, and then to escalate is simply not giving proper way of managing the risk behind. So the proper approach is to think about vulnerabilities as separate cases. I know that you have to group them and categorize them and treat them similarly for similar type of asset, but definitely you need to put different timers on different types of vulnerabilities for different cases. So for instance, you definitely want to consider a vulnerability on a mission critical asset to be to have different deadline for fixing than the same vulnerability on some other asset. So if you treat every vulnerability a separate case, and you, for instance, leverage on ticketing system, and you update every vulnerability ticket as you obtain new information, then you have the ability to measure it cross-functional. So you can say how much vulnerabilities are fixed on a network level, or how many vulnerabilities are required to be fixed on the web application level. So then you can have a very meaningful discussion with the decision makers about finding extra budget and minimizing the risk for your business. And to top it off with the discussion with the business and senior management, you probably need to employ proper tracking of your security efforts. Common mistakes that are lying within that area are not being able to show on the time schedule of the project where the security testing should be done, or where actually is the phase related to mitigation actions. This is something that is happening very, very, I would say, commonly, to assign only a buffer for doing the penetration test and not mitigating the problems afterwards. Usual symptoms that are showing that probably you don't have this proper approach in your management and vulnerability management is when your project are being way above the budget, because you spend more time and more time on fixing the vulnerabilities or finding the vulnerabilities. Or if your project is already postponed a couple of times over the time because there is a crucial vulnerability somewhere there, that also might mean that you haven't planned properly. And of course, if you start a discussion with your senior management and you don't have data, how much it takes, how much more it might take to mitigate the rest of the vulnerabilities, it would be a very, very problematic and troublesome discussion to make the senior management understand why the go live is still postponed. So the proper approach is that you should definitely document the vulnerabilities and the security testing results. This is something that is very like a basic step for any activity that you should do with vulnerability management. But you also need to think about and tracking the time that you spent on both fighting the vulnerability and fixing that. So you can make that assumptions and correct estimation the next time you will do fixing and hunting for the vulnerabilities. So this is something that you definitely need to employ, and this is something that you need to reiterate every time you do another sprint, another release, or another project that you are running, because this knowledge is something that you have to benefit from in the future, and you have to use to have a meaningful discussion with your stakeholders. Okay, so we have finally reached the end. I hope it wasn't too depressing, showing that number of mistakes that happened in what I saw during my my experience and my auditing experience. But I can definitely promise you that getting vulnerability management right is all about trying and about all about getting right experience in your process. So whether you will run your vulnerability management on your own, or whether you will outsource that to external company, remember that the experience is something that you need to look for, and this is something that you definitely need to implement as a learning curve for your process. Okay, just to sum it up, today I'll talk about starting security implementation, security coverage in your processes soon in your engagement, in your processes. You need to think about how to handle the results. So you have to check for the false positives. You have to think about grouping and categorization of the results, because it's really important for the recipient party to read the report with interest and ability to act actively on the results. You also need to think on how to prioritize the mitigation actions. So you have to assign proper severity. You have to think about the impact and likelihood. So you have to drive the actions based on the proper risk rating. And that means that you have to consider other options. So you have to employ cost-benefit analysis, and you have to think about whether avoiding the risk is more logical than getting it fixed. Of course, you also need to think about how to fix your vulnerabilities and how to confirm whether the vulnerabilities have been already fixed. You have to do the risk scanning to check whether your environment hasn't been introduced with new vulnerabilities. And you have to think about the overall process. So you have to employ continual control, and you have to track your results, and you have to report them to the management to make an informed decision in the future about new and novel releases and projects. The last part of today's webinar is the discussion, and I see that there are a couple of questions already posted to the QA module. If you will have another one, definitely use the QA module as Kosmin explained, and I will answer them live. First question that I have here is, could you provide an example of such vulnerability for each advice? Yeah, I think I can go over the advices in detail. So let me just get back one slide before. Okay, so vulnerability around that can come from not starting the process in the security management in a proper time of the development process are really those that are related to the design. So it's really problematic to see vulnerability on the report that states that you have to change the whole design or the architecture totally, because it hasn't been discovered at the beginning, and it's too costly to do so. So it's one of the vulnerabilities that that you can find that can be a part of that first advice. Second advice is it was about false positives. So I think the example that I've shown about a bunch of vulnerabilities being connected to, for instance, Linux OS versus Windows OS host is pretty self-explanatory. Vulnerabilities that can go around categorization and grouping. I can recall one that is specifically interesting is all that vulnerabilities that you have on the report that are connected to your SSL or TLS certificates. So normally the scanner will notify you about every vulnerability there is, about expired SSL certificate or a self-trusted certificate, and many are. So if you just have like hundreds of vulnerabilities related to one specific certificate being installed across the whole network, then yeah, this is something that definitely will be a problem for you to act on. Another way of thinking about vulnerabilities with the prioritization is that the example for vulnerability that is around the prioritization and proper risk management are related to what I've said, to like critical vulnerability that is affecting some testing environment where you have a couple of moderate vulnerabilities that are affecting your production environment. So this is the kind of a vulnerability that you are looking for to differentiate here. When I said about testing your fix, whether it's actually fixed or not, a nice example of that is that sometimes the fix is really not a fix. Sometimes it just hides the vulnerability, and this is something that I saw happening very commonly. So, for instance, you can see authentication scheme problems, like problems with improper handling of cookies or improper handling of credentials, and sometimes that is being changed a little bit, just not to reflect it in the cookies or in the code, but still the sole vulnerability about, for instance, improper initialization of the session ID can be still visible in the environment. And the vulnerabilities that are referring to rescanning after updating, this is a really huge box of vulnerabilities. The one that I provided about the Windows update that has been putting your PC into restart loop. This is something that is a nice examples how you can trade one vulnerability to some other problems or to other vulnerability as well. And the later part about employing continual control and tracking your efforts, this is more of a management activity. So I wouldn't say that there are some necessary examples to those ones, but yeah, feel free to post them yourself in the comment box. Okay, another question that I see here is about creating the fixes. So when we are not able to test our fix in a short time, but in general we are able to do full deep test, but it takes a lot of time. In this case, it is better to commit the fix that is tested only in the basic way, or to wait for a full tested version. It really depends. The answer is that it really depends on the risk rating. So sometimes it might be better to decommission the system. Sorry, not decommission the system, but stop the system from operating until you have that confirmation. But sometimes it might be just easier to go directly and do a hot fixing. I wouldn't recommend doing a hot fixing and not waiting for a full testing, because this is a way of doing and introducing problem to your environment. But sometimes if you are running I would say not necessarily important environment, and the product itself is it doesn't have any security considerations being put on the availability, or it doesn't process secure information, then probably doing a live fix might be considered as a valid option. Another question that I have is that key to success is fast patching, but vulnerabilities are announced a long time after discover, and patches are released even years after that. So why we have to be fast when big players do not care? And this is actually a very, very good question. To answer that is because you're running your business, and the big players sometimes, I wouldn't say that they don't care, but they are sometimes so complex, and they run so complex environments, so stringent environments sometimes due to some numbers of acquisitions and mergers. So their processes might not work uniformly. So I wouldn't say that the big players do not care. What you need to think about is whether your business can accept having a delayed response to vulnerability being fixed, or whether your business can actually afford a major incident to happen in your network with your personal data of your customers. So this is the thing that you should consider when thinking about getting fixes quickly, because it's your business and your reputation at stake. Another question that I see is, what is the best tool to find vulnerabilities? Monitoring connected hosts. I wouldn't say that there is one best tool for finding vulnerabilities. The best approach is to have multiple sources of information tangled together and providing you information about vulnerabilities from different angles. So for instance, if you are operating a comprehensive information security management program, then probably you have an incident management programs, security monitoring, vulnerability management, and many other processes. And all that should actually contribute to finding vulnerabilities. So sometimes you can get reports from your customers about vulnerabilities. Sometimes that happens. So you have to use that knowledge to employ and to fix the vulnerabilities. But sometimes, you will simply need to do a thorough penetration test on your own, or to employ some external company to do that for you. And that might happen to be the best option for finding those complex and sophisticated vulnerabilities. So this is the thing that you have to consider. You have to bundle all of that knowledge and all of that tools together to get real valuable outcome. Another question is, what is the best way for monitoring processes? If you are mentioning the monitoring of the process, it's actually looking at KPIs, proper KPIs of the process. But if you are referring to monitoring of the environment, so to say, looking at the logs, looking at the performance, getting real data from the real system, so I would say it's looking at correlated information. So this is something that Security Operations Center is trying to achieve. So you have to have information from your vulnerability management process, so you need to see all the vulnerabilities. You have to see also what is happening on the network level. So you have to get data from your network devices like firewalls, your load balancers, your intrusion detection systems. You also need to have information from the hosts that are running your application. So you need to see whether the power consumption or CPU usage or processes are being executed as their normal normally are executed, or whether the anomalies are handled in a proper way. And you also need to have information about your file system data. So for instance, whether the crucial files of the configuration of your network aren't changing in some way. In that way, you can have a nice overview of the attack if it is happening. So for instance, imagine that there is an attack being performed. So then you have an information whether the attack that is being pulled off, whether it has been admitted on per firewall or not. If yes, then you probably saw that attack on your intrusion detection system. So you have another confirmation that this attack probably is traversing your network. So if you see after that the CPU usage on your end host or your server is increasing, or you see that database is doing a lot of transactions that it shouldn't do at this normal time of day, and you see that some files are being changed on the file system that they shouldn't have been changed, then you probably have 100% chance of catching that attack happening live. So this is the approach that you should employ to actually monitor your environment. And the last question that I have here is whether the monitoring tool is reliable or not. This is something that I like to consider as not reliable, because I'm a security guy. I don't consider any kind of sources of information as fully reliable. You always have to check that information that is coming to you, whether it's valid or not. Because you can consider that if an attacker fiercely attacked your monitoring tool, you can actually think that the information that they are feeding you might be totally, taken out of thin air. And I think there were cases where the security function within a corporation has been flooded with information from the log reporting tool and monitoring tool about some, very low level and then very not important stuff, like some kind of transactions being not performed or something like that. And within that millions of transactions and millions of logs and millions of alerts, there were some, very, very crucial ones that actually were overshadowed with that information. So I wouldn't say that any kind of tool can be fully reliable until you have a confirmation that it hasn't been changed in any way. Okay, I think that was all of the questions that I had on my QA chat. So thank you very much for today's attendance and these nice questions. I'm really happy to be able to discuss that with you, and stay tuned for next Luxoft technical webinar around technology service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcin, for the in-depth session, and thank you all for the questions. Now it's time to thank you for listening and taking part of the conversation, and I really hope that you've enjoyed the session and the presentation, and that's been useful to you. We'll appreciate if you take the time to answer the short questionnaire, and is the one that you should see on your screens right now. One more time, on behalf of the whole team, thanks a lot, and stay tuned for future events. So good night, everyone.